The white slave trade was not a fringe horror lost to time. For centuries, coastal communities in the Mediterranean and along the Barbary Coast captured thousands of Europeans and Americans, selling them into bondage in markets that many contemporaries treated as a routine of commerce. At its peak, the trafficking was both bureaucratic and brutal, an industry that fed on war, weakness, and the willingness of states to pay for quiet. I'm Michael Carr, former naval officer and historian, and today we will uncover the hidden truth behind that trade, who profited, who resisted, and how a handful of operations changed the rules of engagement on the high seas. In the scenes ahead, you will see failed diplomacy, a captured merchantman, a nocturnal raid, a perilous landing, and a desert march that forced decisions no commander wanted to make. There will be debates over ransom and honor, arson in the docks, the rumble of artillery, and a treaty whose language reshaped maritime law. This is more than statistics. It is a study of human cost, of families torn apart, and of states that chose to act rather than pay. Stay with me as we reconstruct events that reveal why the white slave trade mattered then and why echoes of it still influence naval doctrine today. At the turn of the 19th century, the Mediterranean was a mosaic of competing empires, rising republics, and semi-autonomous principalities that profited from instability. European powers were consumed with continental wars, yet decades of naval warfare had left merchant convoys exposed. Barbary corsairs operated from fortified ports under the nominal authority of pashas, who treated piracy as an arm of revenue collection. Some ports accepted tribute in lieu of blockade, and convoys paid schedules of ransom to pass unmolested. The young United States found itself enmeshed in this system after repeated seizures of its ships. Newspapers printed dire accounts, and merchants lobbied for protection, while diplomats argued that paying tribute was cheaper than blood. In diplomatic dispatches of the period, one finds lines like this attributed to a Mediterranean consul. A sovereign may pay or he may go to war. Both options have costs. The choice to refuse regular payments proved to be a point of divergence. Economies dependent on slave revenues, local elites whose wealth derived from raptos, and coastal garrison commanders who enriched themselves by selling captives clashed with emergent notions of national honor. The scene was set for interventions that would mix blockade, bombardment, and limited landings in an effort to end a trade that blurred the lines between piracy and state-sanctioned extortion. The antagonists in this story were neither mythical nor anonymous. The trafficking networks included corsair captains who took prizes, pashas who trafficked in human cargo, and brokers who arranged sales inland. Pasha Suleiman of the provincial port we will name for clarity ran an office that recorded ransom receipts as municipal revenue. Across the sea, a captain known as Yusuf el-Malik commanded a squadron of corsairs whose flags flew from nimble galleys and a captured frigate. Their methods were systematic. They intercepted lone merchant brigantines, boarded at dawn, cut masts, and dragged crews ashore. Estimates vary, but thousands were taken over decades. Many forced into galley work, others sold in slave markets far from their homelands. A single seizure could yield enough to pay a garrison and reward officers for months. The moral calculus was stark. For merchants like Marina Kovac, who lost her husband to a raid, the state response felt inadequate. For brokers like Ahmed Barakat, the trade was survival and profit. For governments like the new American Republic, the question was whether to pay tribute or to project force beyond familiar waters. When a heavily laden American merchantman ran aground near the harbor under Pasha Suleiman's watch, the incident became the catalyst that shattered complacency. The brig Orion had lost her rudder in a storm and was taken by corsairs at first light. The news reached Captain Elias Monroe, commander of a distant squadron, and Admiral Robert Shaw, who hesitated between issuing a formal protest and striking back. A naval detachment boarded a frigate and prepared for a blockade. Men packed cartridges, officers discussed artillery ranges, and maps were spread across tables. The first moves were naval, but the calculus quickly moved ashore because the prisoners had been dispersed to inner markets and fortified warehouses beyond easy naval reach. Lordly pashas negotiated ransom amounts publicly, while privately instructing commanders to find new captives. The blockade began with the crisp sound of signal guns and the thud of anchor chains as ships held station. In the harbor, the smell of tar, gunpowder, and rotting fish mixed with the tang of sea spray. Cannon shot arced against the sky and splashed near the quay. Diplomatic notes were written and burned as useless. The sequence was clear: naval pressure, diplomatic failure, and the decision to plan a joint land-sea expedition that would reach into the Pasha's hinterland. Preparing the expedition required logistics that few on the home front appreciated. Men had to be provisioned for months. 50 Marines, led by Lieutenant Samuel Price, trained with boarding axes and practiced disembarkations on rocky coves. Carriage horses were requisitioned, medical supplies packed by Dr. Eleanor Voss, and maps were redrawn to show desert routes with scarce wells. Officers argued heatedly about whether to include artillery that would slow them or travel light and strike fast. Quartermaster Thomas Reed kept meticulous lists of oiled ropes, spare masts, powdered lime for signaling, and barrels of fresh water that tasted faintly of iron. On the eve of departure, the men smelled of sweat and boiled meat, the deckboards were slick with oil, and the captain walked the rails smoking a stub of pipe and listening to the sea. The landing itself was rehearsed with shouted orders, ropes creaking, and the scrape of sand under boot. Among the named secondary figures, Marina Kovac organized letters for captives' families. Ahmed Barakat relayed rumors through intermediaries. Lieutenant Price checked compasses while Sergeant Marcus Hill readied the rope ladders and Dr. Voss prepared bandages. The tension of preparation was not just mechanical, it held the weight of potential failure. The main operation unfolded with sensory detail that burned into the memory of survivors. At dawn, the landing craft slipped into a cove, and men felt the cold bite of morning spray on their faces. The sound of oars was a steady percussion that matched the thud of nerves. A sentry shouted orders that snapped like a whip. They saw the low ridge where the enemy had positioned a battery, smelled the sweet smoke of cooking fires mixed with the sour tang of camel dung, and tasted dust that coated their lips. The assault began with a volley that cracked and shook the air. Dialogue in the heat of battle revealed the human calculus in immediate terms. Captain Elias Munro called out, "Hold the line and wait for my signal." Lieutenant Samuel Price answered, "We are ready, sir. Men steady." Sergeant Marcus Hill shouted, "They reload fast. Watch the left flank." Marina Kovac, who had insisted on being present to identify captives, whispered, "There are women at the compound. We must move now." Thomas Reed urged, "Waits at the ramp. If we delay, they will scatter." The final exchange came from Dr. Eleanor Voss through the smoke, "Clear a path for the wounded. We take no prisoners who are dying." Those 6 short exchanges captured strategy, urgency, and human concern. The sensory pressure continued. Guns thudded, cannon smoke stung eyes, the grit of soil scraped skin, and the metallic taste of fear filled mouths. The Marines pushed forward under musket fire, artillery thundered, and at a critical moment, a powder magazine exploded, sending a concussive wave that knocked men to ground and ignited dry brush. The fight was close, chaotic, and costly. 3 moments later would crystallize as tension points in later accounts. First came the decision at the gate when a misunderstanding of orders almost sent the landing force into a prepared trap. Captain Munro hesitated, memories flashing of earlier failures and of the faces of captives he had seen. He smelled smoke and felt the leather of his gloves sweat as he chose a route that skirted the ambush. Second was the negotiation with the Pasha after the garrison fell, when promises of clemency clashed with demands for ransom, and Munro had to decide whether to burn the warehouses where captives were held. The bargaining room reeked of incense and oil, voices were low, and threats hinted at knife edges. Third was the retreat under night, as the sea swelled and small boats crowded with freed men, some too weak to row. The sea slapped the hulls, men coughed salt and blood, and the moon hid behind clouds as the squadron slipped away. Each of these moments was a crucible where memory, duty, and conscience collided. At roughly 1/3 into If the account so far has you torn between outrage and practical doubt, you are not alone. Many viewers ask what they would do in the commander's place. Would you pay the ransom and save lives quickly? Or would you risk a larger operation to break the trade at its source? Start your comment with, "I would pay," or "I would attack," and tell us why. Your perspective helps broaden this discussion and guides future episodes about similar dilemmas. Now we return to the final chapters where consequences were decided. The outcome was neither simple triumph nor unmitigated defeat. The immediate result freed dozens of captives, sank the economic case for small-time corsairs in that district, and embarrassed Pasha Suleiman politically. A treaty was drafted that forbade the carrying of trafficked captives across certain maritime routes and required coastal governors to disband private corsair squadrons. In naval terms, a precedent had been set. A state could mount punitive expeditions to secure its seamen and merchants. The Admiralty instituted new orders for convoy protection, and slow implementation of blockades replaced episodic payments of tribute. Legally, the treaty language influenced later agreements that framed piracy not as a local tax mechanism but as an international crime. The named figures from the operation fared variously. Captain Elias Monroe received a commendation, but carried guilt for men left behind. Lieutenant Samuel Price later wrote in his log about the taste of dust that would not leave his mouth. Marina Kovac returned to rebuild a merchant house and campaigned to record the names of the missing. Ahmed Barakat shifted to legitimate brokerage as ports opened new trade. Dr. Eleanor Voss published a memoir on battlefield medicine that referenced the scenes she could not forget. The garrison at the port was restructured, and some local officers faced trial or exile. 1 month later, the immediate fallout had settled into bureaucratic motion. The freedmen were returned to families where possible, and where not, they were registered as displaced. Newspapers ran accounts that varied from triumphant to forceful condemnation. Admiral Robert Shaw convened a review and recommended institutional changes in naval logistics and patient transport. The harbor where the raid had occurred remained scarred. Pasha Suleiman had been pressured by rivals and faced political isolation. Ransom payments declined temporarily as merchants began to trust convoys escorted by naval squadrons. Within ports, scenes repeated. The smell of charred warehouses lingered, a widow like Marina Kovac smoked her late husband's pipe, and children asked awkward questions. Internationally, diplomats used the event to justify clarifying codes governing maritime capture. For many families, the relief was raw and incomplete. The freed were physically present, yet haunted by captivity. Offices began to log names and issue certificates confirming liberation to counter future fraudulent claims. 3 months later, the picture shifted toward longer-term adaptation. The treaty language reached other ports, and local governors adjusted policy under pressure from larger states. Naval commanders refined tactics for combined land-sea operations, and training manuals were updated to include coordination protocols. Men like Lieutenant Samuel Price trained new detachments in rapid landing techniques, and the Admiralty approved funds for improved medical provisioning after Dr. Voss highlighted preventable deaths. Some local markets collapsed as the most lucrative lines of the slave trade were disrupted, and brokers pivoted to legitimate commerce. Ahmed Barakat opened an agency to manage legal transit papers. Politically, Pasha Suleiman sought alliances, and his rivals sought to exploit his weakened standing. Merchants began to invest in convoy insurance and trust organizations that collected ransoms collectively to avoid ad hoc bargains that enriched corrupt officials. 6 months after the operation, the legacy became institutional and symbolic. The Navy had adopted a doctrine stating that protection of commerce might require offensive action, a shift in posture that shaped decades of operations. Memorials were set up in port towns to honor those who resisted and those who suffered. In the legal realm, the treaty language inspired clauses in later multinational agreements that codified the criminality of trafficking civilians across borders. Captain Elias Monroe retired with honors but wrote letters advocating for pensions for survivors. Marina Kovac founded a small charity to assist freed captives and to lobby for record-keeping so identities would not be lost again. Training regimens now included desert marches and coordination with allied local forces. Economically, some coastal elites diverted profits into infrastructure to maintain stability rather than incentive predation. Perhaps most importantly, the episode shifted public expectations. Citizens began to demand that states not regard tribute as acceptable and that human dignity be a part of maritime security policy. The white slave trade did not vanish overnight, but an axis of military action, legal reform, and civic pressure had been formed. When we step back, the true lesson is not merely tactical. The struggle against the white slave trade shows how international order is sometimes built from gritty, costly choices. Whether to pay to make conflict invisible or to pay in blood to change the rules. The men and women named in this account stand for thousands whose names are lost. If this episode moved you, leave your thoughts below, starting with "I would pay" or "I would attack" and why. Subscribe if you want more episodes that blend archival research with on-the-ground narratives about how states learn to protect their citizens at sea. In the end, the history of the trade is a mirror. It asks whether commerce should override conscience and whether nations will act when systems of exploitation become entrenched. The answer, in this case, came late, imperfect, and consequential. It altered law, changed doctrine, and returned some measure of freedom to those who most needed it.